In the furthest
Soldiers of the
reaches of the
Eternal
galaxy,
Realm,
where
our
three
destiny
suns cast their
SOGs.
dying light
Let
across
your
a
blades
world
glow
of
and your
crystal
hearts burn
spires
with
and floating
valor.
cities, the Zephyrians
Soldiers
had
of the
never known
Woodland
fear.
Realm, the time has
Their
come.
advanced civilization had
Advance.
thrived for millennia. Their technology so sophisticated it seemed like magic to lesser species. They commanded fleets of ships that could bend space itself, wielded energy weapons that could crack planets, and possessed minds that could communicate across vast distances without uttering a single word. But on this day, as their world burned and their people screamed, the mighty Zephyrians did something they had never done in their proud history. They begged. The distress signal that pierced through the cosmic void was not sent in the language of diplomacy or the formal protocols of interstellar communication. It was raw, desperate, transmitted on every frequency they could reach. 3 words, repeated over and over in 100 different tongues, broadcast to every corner of known space. Please help us. What they didn't know was that their cry for salvation would be answered by the most unlikely saviors in the galaxy. A species so young they were barely considered sentient by galactic standards. A people who had only just learned to travel between stars, who still fought with projectile weapons and chemical explosives, who bled red blood and broke easily. Humans. And when those human marines emerged from the fog of war on Zephyros Prime, everything the galaxy thought it knew about strength, courage, and the will to fight would change forever. Commander Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the cold metal bulkhead of the transport ship, watching the stars streak past in brilliant lines of light. 3 months ago, she had been leading routine training exercises on Earth's moon. Now, she was hurtling through space toward a world she had never heard of, carrying orders that made no sense. The briefing had been classified beyond anything she had ever seen. Admiral Chen himself had delivered it, his usually calm demeanor cracked with something that looked almost like panic. The Galactic Council, that distant collection of alien species that barely acknowledged humanity's existence, had sent a formal request. Not a suggestion or a diplomatic overture, but a desperate plea for military assistance. Elena had laughed at first. The idea that any of the advanced alien civilizations would need help from humans was absurd. Earth had only achieved faster-than-light travel 15 years ago. Their best weapons were still based on accelerating chunks of metal at high velocity. Compared to the energy shields and plasma cannons of the galactic powers, human military technology was primitive at best. But Admiral Chen wasn't laughing. His hands had trembled slightly as he activated the holographic display showing a world of impossible beauty being consumed by darkness. Zephyros Prime, home to the Zephyrian Empire, one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. Their crystal cities reached into the clouds, their technology could manipulate matter at the molecular level, and their psychic abilities were the stuff of legend. Something is destroying them, and they can't stop it. The transport ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Elena felt her stomach lurch. Through the viewport, she could see their destination growing larger. Zephyros Prime should have been beautiful, with its 3 suns casting rainbow light across the crystalline structures that covered its surface. Instead, the planet looked wounded. Massive black scars stretched across continents, and strange pulsing veins of darkness seemed to be spreading like an infection. "Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission," called out Sergeant Marcus Webb, her communications specialist. His dark face was creased with concern as he adjusted his headset. "It's from the Zephyrian command structure. They want to speak with our commanding officer." Elena nodded and activated her own communication array. The holographic projector flickered to life, revealing a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The Zephyrian was tall and elegant, with features that seemed carved from pale blue marble. Its large, silver eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient beyond measure. But what shocked Elena wasn't the alien's appearance. It was the desperation in those eyes. "Human Commander," the Zephyrian spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Elena's bones. "I am High Magistrate Veltar of the Third Spire." Our people are dying." Elena had been trained in first contact protocols, had studied the various alien species and their customs. Nothing had prepared her for this moment when one of the galaxy's most advanced beings looked at her with the same expression she had seen on the faces of refugees fleeing war zones. "High Magistrate," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I'm Commander Elena Vasquez of the Human Colonial Marines. We received your distress call and came as quickly as we could. What exactly are we facing here?" Veltar's elegant features twisted with an emotion that transcended species barriers. "Fear. Pure, primal fear that any sentient being could recognize. They call themselves the Devourers," Veltar said, the word seeming to cause physical pain. "They appeared without warning 3 cycles ago." emerging from the dark spaces between stars. Our sensors could not detect them, our weapons cannot harm them, and our psychic defenses, they simply absorb our mental attacks and grow stronger. The hologram flickered, and Elena could see explosions lighting up the sky behind the Zephyrian. The crystal spires that had stood for millennia were crumbling, their rainbow light fading to a sickly gray. "We have lost 12 cities," Veltar continued, its voice breaking. "Millions of our people have been consumed. The Devourers do not simply kill, they absorb the life essence of everything they touch. Our greatest warriors, our most powerful psionics, they all fall the same way, drained of everything that makes them alive, leaving only empty shells." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Through the viewport she could see the darkness spreading across the planet's surface like a living thing. It moved with purpose, consuming everything in its path and leaving only barren wasteland behind. "High Magistrate, with all due respect, if your people can't fight these things, what makes you think we can help?" We're not exactly known for our advanced technology." For the first time, something that might have been hope flickered in Veltar's silver eyes. "That is precisely why we called for you," the alien said. "The Devourers feed on psychic energy, on the advanced technologies that most galactic species rely upon. Your people are different. Your minds emit very little psychic resonance, your weapons are crude but effective, and you possess something that we have observed but never understood." "What's that?" Elena asked. "You call it stubbornness, I believe. The refusal to accept defeat, even when logic suggests no other outcome is possible." Elena almost smiled at that. Was probably the most accurate description of humanity she had ever heard from an alien perspective. "Where do you want us to land?" she asked. Veltar's relief was palpable. "There is a landing platform near the seventh spire, approximately 200 kilometers from the leading edge of the Devourer advance. I will transmit the coordinates. Commander Vasquez, I must warn you that many of our people view your species as primitive. They do not understand why we have called for human assistance. There may be resistance to your presence. We'll deal with that when we come to it," Elena replied. "How much time do we have before the Devourers reach your position?" "At their current rate of advance, perhaps 6 of your hours." Elena felt her training kick in, the familiar calm that came when facing impossible odds. "Then we better get moving." Vasquez out. The hologram faded, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the sight of the dying world below. She activated the ship's internal communication system. "All hands, this is Commander Vasquez. In 30 minutes, we're going to drop onto a planet under attack by hostile forces that have already defeated one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Intelligence is limited, enemy capabilities are unknown, and our allies think we're too primitive to be of any real use." She paused, letting that sink in. "Standard Tuesday for the Marines, in other words. Gear up, check your weapons, and remember that we're representing all of humanity down there. Let's show these aliens what stubborn looks like." The response was immediate. Throughout the ship, nearly 200 Marines began preparing for what might be the most important battle in human history. They cleaned weapons that aliens considered obsolete, checked armor that was primitive by galactic standards, and prepared to face an enemy that had brought one of the galaxy's greatest powers to its knees. Elena made her way to the armory, where her own gear waited. The familiar weight of her assault rifle felt comforting in her hands, even though she knew it might be useless against creatures that could absorb energy and life itself. But it was what they had, and Marines had a long tradition of making do with what they had. As the transport ship began its descent toward Zephyros Prime, Elena couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. For decades, humanity had looked to the stars wondering if they were alone in the universe. When they finally made contact with alien civilizations, they had been dismissed as a young, crude species barely worth acknowledging. Now those same advanced species were begging for help from the primitives they had ignored. The ship touched down with a gentle vibration, and Elena could hear the sound of the loading ramps beginning to lower. Through the ship's external cameras, she could see a delegation of Zephyrians waiting to meet them. They stood in perfect formation, their crystal blue skin catching the light of the 3 suns, their robes flowing in the alien breeze. Behind them, the massive spire of crystal and metal that served as their city reached up toward the sky like a finger pointing at the stars. It was beautiful and alien, and completely unlike anything humanity had ever built. But even from here, Elena could see the signs of fear. The way the Zephyrians stood too close together, the way their eyes kept darting toward the horizon where the darkness was spreading, the way their normally perfect composure seemed cracked around the edges.
"Marines, form up!" Elena called out as she stepped onto the ramp.
The sound of 200 pairs of boots hitting metal in unison echoed through the ship. Remember, we're guests here. Be respectful but stay alert. We don't know what we're walking into. The first thing that hit Elena as she stepped onto the surface of Zephyros Prime was the air. It was thinner than Earth's, with a slightly metallic taste that made her nose wrinkle. The gravity was lighter too, making each step feel like she was bouncing slightly. The second thing was the sound. In the distance, barely audible but unmistakably there, was the sound of screaming. Not the screams of battle or the chaos of war, but something worse. The sound of absolute terror, of people facing something beyond their understanding or ability to fight. The Zephyrian delegation approached with measured steps. Their leader, a female with intricate silver markings covering her arms, raised her hand in what Elena assumed was a greeting gesture. "Commander Vasquez," the alien said in perfect English, her voice carrying those same harmonics Elena had heard from Veltar. "I am Magistrate Sindar, coordinator of the Defense Forces." High Magistrate Veltar sends his apologies for not greeting you personally, but he is needed at the command center. Elena nodded and returned the gesture as best she could. "Magistrate Sindar, thank you for the welcome. What's the current tactical situation?" Sindar's expression grew grim. "The Devourers have consumed the 11th spire entirely. They are now advancing toward the 9th and 10th spires simultaneously. We estimate they will reach the outer defenses of this position within 4 hours." "Show me," Elena said simply. Sindar gestured toward a crystalline platform that hovered a few feet off the ground. Elena and her command staff climbed aboard, trying not to look impressed as the platform rose smoothly into the air without any visible means of propulsion. From 100 feet up, Elena could see the full scope of what they were facing. The Zephyrian city stretched for miles in every direction, a maze of crystal spires and floating platforms connected by bridges of solid light. It should have been magnificent. Instead, it looked like a city under siege. Zephyrian civilians filled the streets below, carrying belongings and moving toward the center of the city with the desperate haste of people fleeing for their lives. Their normally luminous skin seemed dimmed, and many of them kept looking over their shoulders toward the horizon. And at that horizon, Elena could see the enemy. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It moved with purpose, flowing across the landscape like a living thing. Where it passed, everything seemed to wither and die. The crystal formations that dotted the planet's surface lost their glow and crumbled to dust. The very air above the advancing darkness seemed to shimmer with a wrongness that made Elena's eyes water. "How fast does it move?" she asked. "Inconsistently," Sindar replied. "Sometimes it advances several kilometers in an hour. Other times it seems to pause as if feeding. We believe it moves faster when there are more life forms in its path." Elena studied the approaching darkness through her binoculars. She could make out shapes moving within it, but they seemed to shift and flow in ways that didn't make sense to human eyes. Occasionally flashes of light would appear within the darkness, followed by screams that carried on the wind. "What happens to your people when it reaches them?" she asked. Sindar was quiet for a long moment. "They are drained, not just killed, but emptied of everything that makes them who they are. Their memories, their personalities, their very life essence is absorbed. What remains is a shell that can move and speak but contains nothing of the original person." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien air. She had seen war, had witnessed death and destruction on a scale that most humans couldn't imagine. But this was something different. This was the complete annihilation of what made life worth living. "What have you tried so far?" she asked. "Everything," Sindar replied. And for the first time, Elena heard the edge of despair in the alien's voice. "Our most powerful energy weapons simply feed the darkness, making it stronger. Our psychic warriors attempted to attack it mentally, but they were absorbed instantly. We tried to evacuate entire cities, but the darkness moves faster than our escape craft. We even attempted to collapse the mountain ranges between the Devourers and our cities, but the darkness simply flowed over the rubble as if it weren't there." Elena nodded, her mind already working on the problem. It was like facing an enemy that was immune to every weapon in your arsenal, that grew stronger the harder you fought it. But there had to be some weakness they hadn't found yet. "Has anyone tried conventional weapons? Kinetic projectiles, chemical explosives, that sort of thing?" Sindar looked confused. "Such primitive methods would be even less effective than our energy weapons. Why would we attempt something so crude?" "Sometimes crude works," Elena said, remembering her training instructor's words from a lifetime ago. "When you can't go over or around an obstacle, sometimes you have to go through it the hard way." The platform descended back to ground level, where Elena's Marines were busy unloading equipment and setting up a defensive perimeter.
The sight of human soldiers in their practical armor and carrying their projectile weapons drew stares from the Zephyrian civilians. Some looked curious, others seemed almost offended by the humans' crude appearance. Elena couldn't blame them. Compared to the elegant Zephyrians with their flowing robes and crystal technology, humans probably looked like barbarians who had somehow learned to travel between stars.
But barbarians who had survived everything their home world could throw at them.
She reminded herself. Barbarians who had conquered their own planet through stubbornness and a refusal to give up when things looked hopeless. Magistrate Sindar, Elena said as they reached the ground. I want to see the leading edge of the Devourer advance, up close. Sindar's large eyes widened in alarm. Commander, that would be extremely dangerous. Our most experienced warriors have been consumed simply by approaching too closely. Then it's a good thing we're not warriors, Elena replied. We're Marines, there's a difference. As her people continued to unload their equipment, Elena looked up at the three suns of Zephyros Prime. They were starting to set, casting long shadows across the crystal city. Soon it would be dark, and in the darkness the Devourers would continue their advance. But for the first time since the crisis began, humanity was on the field. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was finding new ways to fight when the old ways failed. The real battle was about to begin. The reconnaissance mission to the edge of the Devourer advance was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. She rode in a Zephyrian scout craft that moved without sound or vibration, gliding over the crystalline landscape like a ghost.
The pilot, a young Zephyrian named Kessel, kept his silver eyes fixed on the controls with the intensity of someone trying not to think about what they were approaching. Elena's team consisted of her best scouts, Sergeant Marcus Webb, her communications specialist, Corporal Lisa Chen, her demolitions expert, and Private Jake Morrison, whose talent for getting out of impossible situations had earned him the nickname Miracle Jake among his fellow Marines.
They had left their standard weapons behind, carrying only passive sensors and recording equipment. Approaching the perimeter now, Kessel announced, his harmonious voice tight with fear. Commander, I must insist we do not go closer than 500 meters. Beyond that distance, we risk detection. Elena nodded, though her instincts told her that 500 meters wouldn't be nearly close enough to learn what they needed to know. Through the craft's transparent hull, she could see the edge of the darkness spreading across the landscape like spilled ink. It wasn't simply the absence of light, it was something that seemed to absorb light and hope and life itself. Set us down here, Elena ordered. We're going in on foot. Kessel's pilot's seat swiveled to face her, his expression one of absolute horror. Commander, you cannot be serious. No one approaches the Devourers on foot and survives. The very air around them drains life energy. That's what we're here to test, Elena replied calmly. Your people emit strong psychic energy signatures. Maybe that's what attracts them. Human mental patterns are much quieter. We might be able to get closer without being detected. The scout craft touched down with a whisper of displaced air. Elena checked her equipment one final time. Passive sensors, recording devices, and a small locator beacon that would help the Marines find her body if things went wrong. She had left strict orders that if her team didn't return within 2 hours, the Marines were to proceed with the defensive preparations without her. Jake, I want you to hang back and maintain visual contact with the ship, she ordered. If something happens to the rest of us, you get back and report what you saw. Webb, Chen, you're with me. They stepped out onto the alien ground, and Elena immediately felt the difference. The air here seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The usual background noise of wind and distant wildlife that filled most planets was completely absent. It was as if they had entered a dead zone where nothing lived or grew. The crystals that normally covered Zephyros Prime's surface were present here, but they were dark and lifeless. Their surfaces were cracked and pitted, as if something had been eating away at them from the inside. When Elena touched one of them, it crumbled to dust at her fingertips. Jesus, Webb muttered, adjusting his sensor package. This place feels wrong, ma'am. Like everything here wants to die. Elena nodded, feeling the same oppressive atmosphere pressing down on her. It reminded her of visiting a cemetery at midnight, that sense of being somewhere that belonged to the dead rather than the living. But they needed information, and information required getting close enough to see what they were really facing. They moved forward in standard reconnaissance formation, staying low and using the dead crystal formations for cover. Elena kept her eyes on the darkness ahead, which seemed to writhe and shift even though there was no wind to move it. Occasionally she caught glimpses of shapes moving within the blackness, but they moved in ways that her brain refused to process properly. At 200 meters from the edge of the darkness, Elena called a halt. This was as close as she dared take her people without better protection.
She activated her recording equipment and began documenting everything she could observe. The Devourers weren't a single entity, she realized.
The darkness was made up of countless individual creatures moving together like a living tide. They flowed over the landscape rather than walking, absorbing everything they touched. Where they passed, even the soil turned gray and lifeless. But as she watched, Elena began to notice patterns in their movement.
The creatures seemed to be following specific paths, avoiding certain areas while focusing on others. They moved faster when approaching the crystal formations that dotted the landscape, as if drawn to them specifically.
"Webb, are you picking up any energy signatures from those things?" she asked quietly. Webb adjusted his sensors, frowning at the readings.
That's the weird thing, ma'am. I'm not picking up anything at all.
It's like they don't exist from an electromagnetic perspective. But he paused, checking his instruments again. There's something else. The background radiation level here is dropping. It's like they're absorbing all forms of energy, not just psychic emanations. Elena felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. They're not just psychic vampires.
They're energy vampires, period. That's why the Zephyrian weapons don't work.
Every form of energy they throw at these things just makes them stronger. A new sound reached their ears, carried on the dead air from somewhere within the darkness. It was singing. Hauntingly beautiful voices raised in harmony, but with an undertone that made Elena's skin crawl.
The melody was complex and alien, unlike anything she had ever heard.
"That's Zephyrian singing," Chen whispered, her face pale. "But it sounds wrong somehow." Elena realized what they were hearing with the chill that went straight to her bones. Those were the voices of Zephyrians, who had been absorbed by the Devourers. The creatures weren't just draining their victims, they were using their voices, their memories, their very essence as part of themselves. As if summoned by their attention, several shapes began to move toward their position from within the darkness. Elena could see them more clearly now, and wished she couldn't. They were roughly humanoid, but wrong in every detail. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, and their features seemed to shift and change as she watched. But the worst part was their faces. Each one showed the features of a Zephyrian, but with all emotion and intelligence drained away. They moved with mechanical precision, their silver eyes empty of everything that had once made them alive. "Time to go," Elena said quietly. "Now." They began to withdraw, moving as quietly as possible back toward their landing site. The absorbed Zephyrians followed, but slowly, as if they weren't quite sure what had attracted their attention. Elena's team made it back to the scout craft without being directly confronted, but she could feel those empty eyes watching them from the darkness. "Did you learn what you needed?" Kessel asked as they lifted off.
His relief at seeing them return alive was palpable. "More than I wanted to," Elena replied grimly.
"Take us back to the command center. I need to speak with High Magistrate Velftar immediately."
The flight back to the Seventh Spire gave Elena time to process what she had observed. The Devourers were unlike any enemy humanity had ever faced, but they weren't invincible. They had patterns, preferences, and limitations. The key was figuring out how to exploit those weaknesses using the tools they had available. The command center of the Seventh Spire was a marvel of Zephyrian technology, with holographic displays showing the positions of every citizen and defender in real time. High Magistrate Velftar stood in the center of it all, his elegant form somehow diminished by the weight of responsibility and fear.
"Commander Vasquez," he said as Elena entered, "your return is most welcome."
"What did you observe?"
Elena activated her recording device, projecting the images she had captured onto the chamber's main display. The assembled Zephyrian commanders watched in horrified fascination as the footage played out. "The Devourers are energy absorbers," Elena began. "They drain all forms of energy they encounter, which is why your weapons have been ineffective.
But they're not perfect. They follow specific patterns, they're drawn to energy sources, and they can be observed without immediate detection if you're careful."
Velftar leaned forward, hope flickering in his silver eyes. "You believe there is a way to fight them?" "I think there might be," Elena replied.
"But it's going to require us to throw out everything you know about modern warfare and go back to basics. Very crude basics." She manipulated the holographic display, highlighting several key observations from her reconnaissance. "Look at their movement patterns. They're drawn to your crystal formations, which I'm guessing are some kind of energy storage or transmission system.
They avoid areas where there's no energy to absorb. And most importantly, they don't seem to register our presence the same way they do yours." "But how does this help us?" asked Magistrate Sindar. "Even if they cannot detect you as easily, your primitive weapons cannot possibly harm creatures that absorb energy." Elena smiled. the expression looking decidedly predatory. That's where you're wrong, Magistrate. Our weapons aren't energy-based. They're kinetic. We accelerate chunks of metal using chemical propellants. No energy to absorb, just good old-fashioned momentum and mass. The Zephyrian commanders exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to skepticism. The concept of kinetic weapons was so foreign to their technology base that they were having trouble processing it. Even so, Veltar said carefully, surely such crude methods would be insufficient against creatures of such power.
Maybe, Elena admitted.
But there's something else. Those things we saw, the absorbed Zephyrians walking around like puppets. They're still connected to the main mass somehow, still part of the collective intelligence. What happens to a collective intelligence if you start removing pieces of it? Understanding began to dawn in Veltar's ancient eyes. You propose to attack the absorbed individuals rather than the main collective. More than that, Elena said. I propose to rescue them if possible. Your people aren't gone, High Magistrate. They're trapped inside those shells, being used as extensions of the Devourer consciousness. If we can find a way to sever that connection, she trailed off as alarms began blaring throughout the command center. A Zephyrian technician called out from his station, his voice tight with panic. High Magistrate, the Devourers have accelerated their advance. They're moving faster than our models predicted. The main display shifted to show a real-time tactical overview. The darkness was indeed moving faster, flowing across the landscape like a flood. Elena could see why. The path they were following was rich with crystal formations, each one providing energy for them to absorb. How long until they reach the outer defenses? Veltar asked. But at current speed, less than 2 hours, the technician replied. Elena felt her training kick in, the calm focus that came when there was no more time for planning and preparation. High Magistrate, I need you to do something that's going to sound insane. At this point, Commander, insane may be our only option. I need you to shut down all energy weapons, all power grids, everything that generates or stores energy in the outer defensive perimeter. Make it as unattractive to them as possible. Veltar's expression was one of absolute horror. Commander, without our defense grids, the outer perimeter is completely vulnerable. That's the point, Elena replied. We're going to let them get close, closer than they've ever been to a defended position, and then we're going to hit them with something they've never encountered before. She activated her communicator, connecting her to the Marine staging area. Sergeant Morrison, this is Commander Vasquez. I want every Marine armed and ready for combat in 30 minutes. Full kinetic loadout, maximum ammunition, and tell the heavy weapons teams to break out everything they brought. Morrison's voice crackled back over the comm. Ma'am, what's our target? Elena looked at the tactical display, where the advancing darkness was now less than an hour away from the outer defenses. In that darkness were thousands of absorbed Zephyrians, their voices still raised in that haunting, empty song. Somewhere in those stolen shells, the real people might still exist waiting for rescue. Sergeant, we're going hunting, she said. And we're using the oldest hunting method in human history. Persistence predation.
Ma'am,
We're going to run them down, Sergeant. We're going to chase them until they can't run anymore, and then we're going to take back every single person they've stolen. As Elena ended the transmission, she could see the doubt in the Zephyrian commander's eyes. They had called for human help in desperation, but they clearly hadn't expected the humans to propose something so audacious. But then Veltar stepped forward, his ancient eyes fixed on Elena with something she hadn't seen before. Respect, Commander Vasquez, he said formally. The defense of Zephyros Prime is yours to command. Our people and our resources are at your disposal. Elena nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. In the distance, she could hear the sound of her Marines preparing for battle. The familiar sounds of weapons being checked, armor being adjusted, and soldiers making peace with the possibility of death. It was the sound of humanity preparing to do what it did best, fighting against impossible odds with nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to surrender. The Devourers had never faced an enemy like humans before. They were about to learn why the young species had conquered their own world despite having no natural weapons, no thick hide, and no psychic powers. They were about to discover what happened when you threatened something that humans cared about. The fog of war was beginning to descend on Zephyros Prime, and when it lifted, the galaxy would never be the same again. The battle began at dawn when the three sons of Zephyros Prime cast long shadows across the crystal plains. Elena stood on the observation deck of the Seventh Spire, watching her Marines take their positions in the defensive line she had ordered constructed. It looked nothing like a traditional military position. Instead of energy barriers and plasma cannons, the human defensive line consisted of earthworks, trenches, and firing positions that could have been pulled from Earth's history books. The Zephyrian engineers had looked at Elena's specifications with confusion and dismay, unable to understand why anyone would want to build fortifications from dirt and metal when they had energy shields available. But Elena knew something the Zephyrians didn't. Energy shields would only feed the enemy and make them stronger. What they needed was good old-fashioned cover that provided protection through mass and density rather than technological sophistication. "Ma'am, all squads report ready," came Sergeant Morrison's voice through her communicator. Elena could see him in the central command bunker, a reinforced position that had been built into a natural rise in the crystal plane. From there, he had visual contact with all Marine positions and could coordinate their response. Elena activated the tactical display, which showed the approaching Devourer force as a massive blob of darkness moving steadily toward their positions. The advanced edge of the enemy was now less than 5 kilometers away, close enough that she could see individual shapes moving within the black mass. "All stations, this is command." Elena broadcast on the general frequency. "Remember, we are not here to destroy the enemy. We are here to rescue our allies who have been taken by the enemy. Every absorbed Zephyrian you see down there was once a living person with families and friends who are counting on us to bring them home." She paused, looking down at the Marines in their positions. They were good soldiers, the best humanity had to produce, but they had never faced anything like what was coming toward them. "These things have never fought humans before," she continued. "They don't know how stubborn we can be, how far we're willing to go to protect people we care about. Today we're going to show them why humans spread across their entire home planet despite having no natural weapons except our brains and our refusal to give up." The response came back as a wave of acknowledgement from 200 Marines spread across the defensive line. They were ready. Elena turned to High Magistrate Beltar, who stood beside her watching the approaching darkness with eyes that held too much grief to measure. "High Magistrate, are your people ready to assist with the rescue operations?" Beltar nodded, though his expression remained grim. "Our medical teams are standing by to receive any individuals you are able to recover. However, Commander, I must ask again. Are you certain that kinetic weapons will be effective against creatures that have resisted our most advanced technologies?" Elena checked her sidearm. A simple projectile weapon that fired chemically propelled bullets. Compared to the elegant energy weapons carried by Zephyrian soldiers, it looked crude and primitive. But it had one advantage that no energy weapon could claim. It was completely mechanical.
High Magistrate, when the first humans figured out how to throw rocks more accurately than their neighbors, they conquered the world.
When they figured out how to make better rocks and throw them faster, they conquered their skies. When they figured out how to throw rocks so fast they could reach other stars, they conquered space itself. She smiled, the expression holding a confidence she hoped she actually felt. "Today we find out if the rocks we've learned to throw are fast enough to free your people." The first contact came at exactly 0800 hours local time. The leading edge of the Devourer advance struck the outer perimeter Elena had established, a series of motion detectors and passive sensors that would alert them to enemy movement without providing any energy signature for the creatures to follow. "Contact, contact," came the call from Private Rodriguez, manning the forward observation post. "Multiple targets approaching from the northeast, distance 3 kilometers and closing." Elena raised her binoculars and focused on the advancing darkness. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The absorbed Zephyrians were moving ahead of the main mass, walking with mechanical precision across the crystal plane. There were hundreds of them, their movements perfectly coordinated as if controlled by a single mind. But that wasn't what shocked her. What shocked her was that she could recognize individual faces among the absorbed. High Magistrate Veltar had provided her with personnel records, and she had studied the faces of the missing Zephyrians extensively. There was Scholar Fesisty from the Academy of Sciences, still wearing the elegant robes that marked her academic rank. There was Commander Kelvash of the Planetary Guard, his ceremonial armor now dark and tarnished. They were all there, walking toward the human defensive positions with empty silver eyes and no trace of the personalities that had once inhabited those bodies. "Range, 2 kilometers and closing," Rodriguez reported. "Ma'am, they're moving in formation. Definitely organized, definitely intelligent." Elena nodded, though her stomach twisted as she watched the approaching figures. The plan she had developed depended on her theory that the absorbed Zephyrians were still connected to the main Devourer mass, still part of its collective consciousness. If she was wrong, if they were truly gone, then what she was about to order would be nothing short of murder. "All stations, hold your fire until my command," she ordered. "Remember, these are victims, not enemies. We want to disable and recover, not destroy." The absorbed Zephyrians continued their advance with the steady inevitability of a tide. They showed no awareness of the human defensive positions, No recognition that they were walking into a trap. Their empty eyes were fixed straight ahead, their movements perfectly synchronized. At 1 kilometer, Elena could hear them singing. It was the same haunting melody she had heard during her reconnaissance mission, the voices of the absorbed raised in harmony. But now she could make out individual voices within the chorus, and the beauty of it was heartbreaking. These had been people with hopes and dreams and families who loved them, reduced to nothing more than extensions of an alien consciousness. Range, 500 meters. Rodriguez called out. Ma'am, they're not slowing down. Whatever they're after, it's not us. Elena realized he was right. The absorbed Zephyrians were walking past the concealed marine positions without showing any awareness of their presence. They were heading directly for the 7th spire, drawn by the energy signatures emanating from the crystal structure. This is it, she said into her communicator. All stations implement Capture Protocol Alpha. Go, go, go. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 200 Marines rose from concealment simultaneously, their weapons trained on the absorbed Zephyrians walking past their positions. But instead of the energy weapons or explosive ordnance that the creatures had learned to expect, they faced something completely different. The first shots were fired by Corporal Martinez's squad, using weapons that had been specially modified for this mission. Instead of bullets, they fired nets made of ultra-strong polymer fibers designed to entangle and immobilize targets without causing permanent damage. The nets spread out as they flew, wrapping around individual absorbed Zephyrians and bringing them to the ground. The effect was immediate and dramatic. As each absorbed Zephyrian was immobilized, the perfect coordination of the group faltered. They began moving erratically, some stopping entirely while others continued forward with jerky, uncertain steps. It's working. Alina breathed. The connection between the absorbed individuals and the main collective was being disrupted by the simple act of physically preventing them from moving in coordination. But the victory was short-lived. From within the main mass of darkness, new shapes began to emerge. These were not absorbed Zephyrians, but something else entirely. They moved like liquid shadow, flowing across the ground at incredible speed. Where they touched the captured Zephyrians, the nets simply dissolved, freeing the prisoners to rejoin the collective. Contact rear, came a shout from Sergeant Webb's position. We've got movement from multiple directions. Elena spun around to see more of the shadow creatures flowing around the flanks of the marine positions. They had been so focused on the absorbed Zephyrians that they hadn't noticed the Devourer collective sending its true warriors to protect its captured assets. All squads, switch to primary weapons, Elena ordered. Target the shadow creatures, avoid hitting the absorbed if possible. The battle erupted into chaos as 200 Marines opened fire with their assault rifles. The sound of gunfire echoed across the crystal plains, a harsh mechanical roar that contrasted sharply with the elegant silence of Zephyrian technology. The results were immediate and shocking. The bullets, simple chunks of metal accelerated by chemical explosives, tore through the shadow creatures like they were made of paper. Where energy weapons had been absorbed harmlessly, the kinetic impacts actually damaged the Devourers. They reeled back from the marine positions, their forms writhing in what could only be pain. "Holy shit, it's actually working," shouted Private Morrison as he emptied his magazine into a shadow creature that had been trying to flank his position. The creature collapsed, its form dissolving into a puddle of dark liquid that steamed in the alien air. But for every shadow creature they destroyed, 2 more seemed to emerge from the main mass. Elena realized that they were fighting a delaying action at best. The collective had thousands of absorbed individuals and an unknown number of shadow warriors. Her 200 Marines, no matter how well equipped or determined, couldn't hold out indefinitely. "Morrison, implement fallback plan beta," she ordered. "We're going hunting." The fallback plan was something that would have been considered suicidal by any conventional military standard. Instead of defending a fixed position, Elena's Marines began advancing toward the main Devourer mass. They moved in small teams using hit-and-run tactics to rescue as many absorbed Zephyrians as possible while avoiding direct confrontation with the larger shadow creatures. It was dangerous, chaotic, and completely insane. It was also working. The key insight Elena had gained from her reconnaissance was that the absorbed individuals were the collective's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. They provided the intelligence and knowledge that allowed the Devourers to operate effectively in each new environment they encountered. But they were also vulnerable to physical disruption in ways that the shadow creatures were not. Corporal Chen's demolition team had developed a particularly effective technique. They used shape charges to create localized sonic booms that disrupted the neural connections between absorbed individuals and the collective consciousness. The effect was temporary, lasting only a few minutes, but it was long enough for Marines to move in and evacuate the freed prisoners. "Recovery Team 7, we've got 12 more liberated prisoners heading your way," came Chen's voice over the communicator. They're confused and disoriented, but they're responsive to verbal commands. Elena felt a surge of hope as she watched Zephyrian medical teams moving forward to collect the rescued prisoners. The plan was working better than she had dared hope,
But she knew they were fighting against time. The longer the battle continued, the more likely it was that the main collective would adapt to their tactics.
all teams prepare for Phase 2, she ordered. We're going after the source. Phase 2 was the part of the plan that Elena hadn't shared with High Magistrate Veltar because she knew he would have tried to stop her. While her Marines continued the rescue operation, she was going to take a small team directly into the heart of the Devourer Collective. The goal wasn't to destroy it. That was probably impossible with the resources they had available. The goal was to find the central consciousness that was controlling the absorbed individuals and disrupt it long enough for a mass evacuation. It was a long shot based on theoretical understanding of collective intelligence systems. But it was the only chance they had to save the thousands of Zephyrians who were still trapped within the darkness. Elena checked her equipment one final time. Alongside her standard weapons, she carried several experimental devices that the marine science teams had cobbled together during the voyage to Zephyros Prime. Sonic disruptors that might interfere with the collective's communication systems. Electromagnetic pulse generators that could disable technology without providing energy for the creatures to absorb. And one weapon that was so simple it was almost primitive, a sword. Not an energy blade or a molecular disruptor, but a simple steel sword that had been forged in the traditional manner. If Elena was right about the nature of the Devourer Collective, its greatest weakness might be something that was completely outside its experience. Sergeant Morrison, you have command of the rescue operation, she said. Continue extraction procedures until all absorbed prisoners are recovered or until I order you to withdraw. Morrison's face appeared on her visor display, his expression one of concern mixed with admiration. Ma'am, are you sure about this? Going into that thing alone is.
Not alone, Sergeant.
Elena replied. I'm taking volunteers. She activated the general communication frequency.
This is Commander Vasquez. I need 3 volunteers for a high-risk reconnaissance mission into enemy territory.
No guarantees of survival, but we might be able to end this thing once and for all. The response was immediate. Every single Marine on the battlefield volunteered. Elena smiled as she selected her team. Corporal Chen for her demolition expertise, Private Jake Morrison for his ability to get out of impossible situations, and Sergeant Webb for his communication skills. It was a good team, small enough to move quickly but skilled enough to adapt to whatever they encountered. High Magistrate Veltar, she said, opening a channel to the command center. We're going to try to cut off the head of the snake. If this works, the absorbed individual should be freed automatically. If it doesn't work, Commander. Veltar's voice carried across the communication link with a formality that somehow conveyed deep respect.
Whatever happens, you and your people have already given us more hope than we have had in cycles. The Zephyrian people will remember this day.
Elena nodded, though she knew Veltar couldn't see the gesture. Just have your medical teams ready. If this works, we're going to have a lot of confused and traumatized people who need help. She shouldered her weapon and began moving toward the heart of the darkness, where the true battle was about to begin. Behind her, the sounds of combat continued as her Marines fought to rescue every absorbed Zephyrian they could reach. Ahead of her lay the unknown, the source of the collective intelligence that had brought one of the galaxy's greatest civilizations to its knees. But Elena Vasquez was a Marine, and Marines had a tradition of walking into impossible situations and finding a way to win. Today she would discover whether that tradition was strong enough to face an enemy that existed beyond the normal rules of warfare. The fog of battle was thickening around Zephyros Prime, and somewhere within that fog, humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat was about to meet an alien intelligence that had never learned the meaning of failure. One way or another, the deadlock was about to be broken. Moving through the heart of the Devourer Collective was like walking through a living nightmare. Elena and her 3-person team advanced through a landscape that defied every law of physics and biology they understood. The ground beneath their feet felt soft and yielding, as if they were walking on flesh rather than earth. The air itself seemed thick and oppressive, carrying whispers in languages that predated human civilization. Corporal Chen moved beside Elena, her demolition equipment carefully secured to avoid making noise. The shaped charges and sonic disruptors she carried represented humanity's best guess at how to fight an enemy that absorbed energy, but they were still working with incomplete information about what they faced. Behind them, Private Morrison and Sergeant Webb maintained communication with the outside world, though the signal was growing weaker the deeper they penetrated into the collective. The darkness around them wasn't simply the absence of light, it was something that actively consumed electromagnetic radiation, making their equipment unreliable and their situation increasingly desperate.
Ma'am, I'm losing contact with base. Webb reported quietly. The interference is getting stronger.
Elena nodded, though she had expected as much.
The Devourer Collective was clearly designed to cut off communication between its prisoners and the outside world, preventing coordinated resistance. But humans had dealt with communication blackouts before, and Marines were trained to operate independently when command and control broke down.
Switch to hand signals from here on, she ordered. And remember, our primary objective is intelligence gathering. We need to understand how this thing works before we try to destroy it. They continued deeper into the collective, guided by the steady pulse of absorbed voices singing their haunting chorus.
Elena had noticed that the singing grew louder and more complex the closer they came to what she assumed was the center of the intelligence. If her theory was correct, that meant they were approaching the control nexus where the collective consciousness coordinated its absorbed prisoners.
The landscape around them began to change as they advanced. The soft, flesh-like ground gave way to a surface that looked almost crystalline, but wrong in ways that made Elena's eyes water when she looked at it directly. Structures that might have been buildings or might have been organs rose from the ground, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to watch.
And, everywhere, the absorbed moved in perfect coordination. Thousands of them, representing dozens of different species from across the galaxy. Elena could see Zephyrians, but also others. Tall, graceful beings with features like living marble. Short, stocky creatures with skin that looked like polished metal. Things that might once have been energy beings but now walked in solid forms that seemed to pain them. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible even in the oppressive silence.
How many species has this thing consumed? Elena didn't answer, but she was thinking the same thing. The Devourers weren't just attacking Zephyros Prime. They were the remnants of a galactic conquest that had been going on for years, possibly decades. Every species they had encountered and absorbed had added to their knowledge and capabilities, making them more dangerous with each victory.
But they had never encountered humans before, and that might be the only advantage Elena's team had. They approached one of the organic structures, drawn by the sound of voices speaking in what Elena recognized as the Zephyrian diplomatic language.
Through a membrane that might have been a window, she could see absorbed Zephyrians working at what looked like control stations. They were accessing databases, reviewing tactical information, and coordinating the collective's strategic response.
They're using the absorbed as living computers, Chen whispered, her voice tight with horror. All that knowledge and experience turned into tools for the enemy. Elena studied the scene, her tactical mind automatically analyzing what she was observing. The absorbed weren't just mindless drones.
They retained their skills and knowledge, but those capabilities were being directed by the collective consciousness for its own purposes. It was like watching skilled professionals being forced to use their expertise to destroy everything they had once worked to protect. But as she watched, Elena noticed something that made her heart race with possibility. The absorbed Zephyrians working at the control stations moved with mechanical precision, but occasionally one of them would pause, their movements becoming slightly erratic.
For just a moment their eyes would clear, showing a flicker of the personality that had once inhabited that body. The connection isn't perfect, she breathed. There are moments when they break through. She activated her recording equipment, documenting everything she could observe about the control center and the absorbed individuals operating it. This information might be crucial for developing more effective rescue techniques, if they survived long enough to use it. A new sound reached their ears, different from the constant chorus of absorbed voices. It was deeper, more resonant, carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate in their bones. As they listened, the sound resolved into something that might have been speech, if speech could be made from the last breath of dying stars. The Nexus, Webb said quietly.
That has to be the Central Intelligence. Elena nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. They had found what they were looking for, but now they had to figure out how to approach it without being absorbed themselves. The concentration of collective consciousness around the Nexus would be overwhelming, far beyond anything their limited defenses could handle.
But as they observed the area around the Nexus, Elena noticed something interesting. The absorbed individuals working there moved in very specific patterns, following predetermined paths that never varied.
If her team could time their movement correctly, they might be able to reach the central structure without being detected. Chen, I want you to place shaped charges around the support structures of that building, Elena ordered, pointing to what looked like the primary control center.
If we can bring it down, it might disrupt the collective's coordination long enough for our people to complete the rescue operations. Chen nodded and began unpacking her equipment. The charges she carried were designed to create focused kinetic impacts rather than energy releases, making them theoretically useless to the energy-absorbing collective.
But they should be effective at destroying physical structures. While Chen worked, Elena and Morrison conducted surveillance on the Nexus itself. What they saw defied description. The structure was simultaneously organic and mechanical, crystalline and liquid. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched the absorbed cores, and occasionally Elena could see shapes moving within its translucent walls. "Ma'am, I think I understand how this works," Morrison said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and revulsion. "The Nexus isn't just commanding the absorbed individuals, it's experiencing everything they experience, learning everything they know. It's like a giant brain that's hooked into thousands of different nervous systems." Elena felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking together. The Devourers weren't just energy vampires or even simple parasites. They were a form of collective intelligence that grew stronger and more capable by absorbing the experiences and knowledge of other species. Every world they conquered didn't just add to their numbers, it added to their understanding of the universe. But collective intelligences had weaknesses that individual minds didn't. They relied on the connections between their components to function effectively. Disrupt those connections, and the entire system could collapse. "Webb, I need you to set up the electromagnetic pulse generators around the Nexus," she ordered. "Target the areas where the absorbed individuals seem to be most concentrated. If we can disrupt their neural connections simultaneously, the whole thing should come apart," Webb finished. Like cutting the strings on a puppet. The plan was dangerous and required precise timing. They would have to place their charges and devices in the heart of the collective intelligence while avoiding detection by thousands of absorbed individuals. One mistake, one moment of being spotted, and they would join the ranks of the absorbed themselves. But it was their only chance to end the threat to Zephyros Prime and potentially free the thousands of captured individuals from across the galaxy. Elena checked her chronometer. They had been inside the collective for over an hour, and she knew that Morrison's rescue operations couldn't continue indefinitely. The longer this took, the more likely it was that the collective would adapt to their tactics and find ways to counter them. 30 minutes, she told her team. We place our charges, set the timers, and get out. Then we let physics do what energy weapons couldn't. They moved forward with the careful precision of soldiers who knew that one mistake would mean not just death, but something far worse. The absorbed individuals around them continued their work, their movements perfectly coordinated but somehow mechanical. Occasionally, Elena caught glimpses of the personalities trapped within those shells, brief moments when recognition flickered in empty eyes. She made a silent promise to each of them. If the plan worked, if they could disrupt the collective consciousness that held them prisoner, those people would be free to return to their families and their lives. If it didn't work, at least the human rescue operation would buy time for more Zephyrians to escape. The charges were placed with surgical precision. Chen's shaped explosives around the support structures, Webb's EMP generators at key neural connection points, and Elena's sonic disruptors positioned to create maximum interference with the collective's communication systems. When they detonated simultaneously, the resulting disruption should cascade through the entire network. But as they prepared to withdraw, the collective suddenly went silent. The constant chorus of absorbed voices stopped abruptly, leaving only an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against their minds. Around them, thousands of absorbed individuals stopped their activities and turned toward their position with perfect synchronization. "Time to go," Elena said quietly. Now. They ran through the heart of the collective intelligence, while absorbed beings from a dozen different species pursued them with mechanical determination. The landscape around them began to shift and flow, as if the collective was trying to physically prevent their escape. Passages that had been open moments before sealed themselves shut, while new obstacles emerged from the ground to block their path. But Elena had chosen her team well. Morrison found routes through the shifting maze that seemed impossible. Chen cleared obstacles with precisely placed explosives, and Webb maintained their bearing even when the environment seemed to twist around them. Behind them, the absorbed pursuers moved with the coordination of a single mind, but they lacked the adaptability and creative thinking that had made humans successful on their homeworld. They followed predetermined patterns, and patterns could be predicted and exploited. Elena's team reached the edge of the collective just as the charges detonated. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, a deep harmonic resonance that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The organic structures around the Nexus collapsed in sequence, while the EMP generators created cascading electromagnetic pulses that overloaded the neural connections between absorbed individuals. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Across the collective,
Thousands of absorbed beings suddenly stopped moving in coordination. They stumbled, fell, or simply stood still, as the controlling intelligence lost its grip on their minds.
The perfect harmony of their cores dissolved into chaos as individual voices broke free from the collective pattern. "It's working," Chen shouted over the sound of collapsing structures. "The neural network is breaking down." Elena didn't celebrate yet. They still had to get back to the marine lines, and she suspected that the collective consciousness wasn't destroyed, merely disrupted. But the disruption should last long enough for the rescue operations to save hundreds or thousands of captured individuals. As they emerged from the darkness, Elena could see the effects of their sabotage spreading across the battlefield.
Absorbed Zephyrians who had been fighting against the Marines moments before were now standing confused and disoriented, their eyes showing the first signs of returning awareness. The shadow creatures that had served as the collective's warriors were dissolving, their forms losing coherence as the controlling intelligence weakened.
"Command, this is Vasquez," Elena called into her communicator as the signal strength returned. "Package delivered."
Recommend immediate implementation of mass evacuation protocols. High Magistrate Veltar's voice came back immediately, filled with an emotion Elena had never heard from the usually composed alien.
"Commander, we can see the effects from here. The absorbed individuals across the entire battlefield are showing signs of returning consciousness. How long will the disruption last?" Elena looked back at the collective, which was still writhing and shifting as its neural network struggled to re-establish control. "Unknown, High Magistrate. But I recommend we make the most of whatever time we have."
The next hour was a blur of rescue operations, as Marines and Zephyrian medical teams worked to evacuate as many freed prisoners as possible. Elena's disruption had worked better than she had dared hope, breaking the collective's control over thousands of absorbed individuals simultaneously.
But she knew this was only a temporary victory. The Devourers were still alive, still dangerous, and still capable of rebuilding their network given enough time.
They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. As the last of the rescued prisoners were evacuated to safety, Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had proved that the seemingly invincible enemy could be defeated, that advanced technology wasn't always superior to determined ingenuity, and that sometimes the best solution was the simplest one. The fog of war was beginning to clear, and when it did, the galaxy would know that humanity was more than just another young species stumbling toward the stars. They were survivors, fighters, and protectors who would stand against any threat to the innocent. The real test was yet to come.
3 days after the battle, Elena stood in the Hall of Remembrance within the Seventh Spire, surrounded by more than 8,000 Zephyrians who had been freed from the Devourer Collective. The great chamber was filled with the sound of reunions as families found each other again, as scholars returned to their research, as warriors remembered their oaths to protect their people. But Elena's attention was focused on the small group of humans who stood beside her. 200 Marines had answered the call for help from a species they had never met, to fight an enemy they didn't understand, on a world they had never seen.
37 of them would not be going home. The casualties had been lighter than Elena had feared, but heavier than she had hoped. The final phase of the battle, when the collective had attempted to reassert control over its absorbed prisoners, had cost them dearly. But every Marine had died fighting to protect people they had sworn to save, and their sacrifice had made the rescue of thousands possible. High Magistrate Veltar approached, his elegant form moving with a grace that somehow conveyed both dignity and humility. In his hands he carried a crystal formation that seemed to capture and reflect the light of all three suns.
"Commander Vasquez," he said, his harmonious voice carrying across the chamber with perfect clarity. "The Zephyrian people have debated for 2 days about how to properly honor what you and your soldiers have done for us.
We have no tradition for thanking those who have given so much to strangers." Elena looked around the chamber, seeing the faces of people who had been rescued from a fate worse than death. Children who would grow up free, scholars who would continue their research, artists who would create beauty instead of serving as tools for destruction. "High Magistrate, we didn't come here for honor or recognition," she replied.
"We came because you asked for help, and helping people is what humans do."
Veltar's silver eyes widened slightly at that simple statement.
"Is it truly so simple for your species?"
To risk everything for those you do not know? Elena thought about that question, considering all the times in human history when people had made similar choices. Soldiers who died protecting civilians they had never met. Rescue workers who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Ordinary people who chose to help when they could have simply walked away.
Not simple, High Magistrate, never simple.
But necessary. Veltar raised the crystal formation, and Elena could see that it contained something impossible. Moving within the translucent structure were what looked like star systems, complete galaxies, entire universes captured in miniature.
This is a memory crystal, Veltar explained. It contains the history of our people, our knowledge, our culture, everything that makes us who we are. For 10,000 cycles we have guarded this knowledge, sharing it only with those who have proven themselves worthy of our trust. He extended the crystal toward Elena, and she could feel energy radiating from it. Gentle, but vast beyond measure. We give this to humanity not as payment for services rendered, but as recognition that your species possesses something we had forgotten. The willingness to sacrifice for others, the determination to fight impossible battles, the refusal to abandon those who need help. Elena accepted the crystal, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. The knowledge contained within it represented thousands of years of scientific advancement, cultural development, and philosophical understanding. It was a gift beyond price. There's something else, Veltar continued. The Galactic Council has been monitoring the situation here. Your victory over the Devourers has caused considerable discussion among the member species. Elena raised an eyebrow. In all their interactions, the Galactic Council had shown little interest in humanity beyond acknowledging their existence. The idea that human military actions had caught their attention was both encouraging and concerning. What kind of discussion? She asked. The kind that results in formal invitations to join interstellar alliances, offers of technological exchange, and requests for military cooperation agreements. Velta replied with something that might have been amusement. It seems that your species' reputation for stubbornness has become a valuable strategic asset. Before Elena could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. The Zephyrian civilians looked around in confusion and fear, memories of the recent crisis still fresh in their minds. But Elena recognized the alert pattern from her briefings. It wasn't an attack warning. It was a hyperspace arrival notification. Through the transparent walls of the chamber, Elena could see ships materializing in orbit around Zephyros Prime. Dozens of them, representing fleets from across the galaxy. Sleek Zephyrian vessels with their crystal-based hulls, massive Corvin battleships that looked like mobile space stations, and elegant Valori craft that seemed to be made of pure energy. But dominating the formation was a ship Elena recognized from intelligence briefings. The GSV Harmony of Spheres, flagship of the Galactic Council itself. It appears the Council has decided to make their interest in humanity known, Veltar observed. They have requested a formal meeting with your commanding officer, Commander. Elena felt a moment of vertigo as she realized what was happening. 3 months ago, she had been a Marine commander leading training exercises on Earth's moon. Now she was being invited to meet with the governing body of galactic civilization as humanity's representative. I should probably mention, she said carefully, that I don't actually have the authority to negotiate on behalf of my entire species. Veltar's expression became what Elena had learned to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of a smile. Commander, you have just defeated an enemy that brought our civilization to the brink of extinction. You have rescued thousands of our people from a fate worse than death. You have demonstrated tactical creativity, strategic thinking, and moral courage that has impressed species with millennia more experience than yours. He gestured toward the memory crystal in her hands. I believe you have more authority than you realize. The meeting with the Galactic Council took place aboard the Harmony of Spheres, in a chamber designed to accommodate representatives from dozens of different species. Elena found herself seated at a table that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, facing beings whose existence she had only known from intelligence reports. Counselor Threndar of the Corvin Hegemony was a massive creature that looked like it had been carved from living stone. Counselor Ishahal of the Valori Collective appeared as a shifting pattern of energy that somehow conveyed intelligence and personality. There were others representing species Elena had never heard of, beings so alien that her mind struggled to process their appearance. But they all looked at her with the same expression of curiosity and respect. Commander Vasquez, spoke Counselor Morthan, the Zephyrian representative who served as current council president. The Galactic Council wishes to formally thank humanity for its intervention on Zephyros Prime. Your tactical approach to the Devourer threat has provided insights that may prove valuable in defending against similar entities. Elena nodded, still feeling somewhat surreal about the entire situation. We were honored to help, Counselor. The Zephyrian people showed courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. All we did was provide a different perspective. Indeed, rumbled Counselor Threndar, his voice like distant thunder. A perspective that proved devastatingly effective. The Corvin hegemony would be interested in establishing military cooperation agreements with humanity. Your species' approach to kinetic warfare could complement our existing defensive strategies. The Valori Collective concurs, added Counselor Yusishal. their energy form pulsing with what Elena interpreted as enthusiasm.
Human mental patterns show resistance to psychic manipulation that could prove valuable in future encounters with entities similar to the Devourers. Elena found herself in the position of inadvertently negotiating humanity's entry into galactic politics. It wasn't something she had expected when she accepted the mission to Zephyros Prime, but it was what the situation demanded.
Before we discuss formal alliances, she said carefully, I need to understand something. How many other threats like the Devourers exist out there? The silence that followed her question was answer enough. The greatest civilizations in the galaxy, with all their advanced technology and accumulated wisdom, were facing threats they couldn't handle alone. Too many, Counselor Morthon admitted. The Devourers were merely one of several entities that exist in the dark spaces between stars. There are others equally dangerous, equally resistant to conventional military responses. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again. This wasn't just about one battle or one rescue operation.
This was about humanity's role in a galaxy that was far more dangerous than they had realized.
Then I think we need to talk, she said.
The negotiations lasted for hours, with Elena finding herself representing not just the human colonial marines but humanity's interests in general. She agreed to technology exchanges that would advance human science by centuries, establish defense agreements that would protect Earth from threats they didn't even know existed, and open diplomatic channels that would forever change humanity's place in the galaxy.
But more importantly, she established humanity's reputation as the species you called when conventional solutions weren't enough. When energy weapons failed, when advanced technology was useless, when the impossible needed to be accomplished anyway, humans would be there. As the formal ceremonies concluded and Elena prepared to return to Earth with news that would change everything, High Magistrate Velter approached her one final time. Commander, he said quietly, there is something I must ask.
When my people were facing extinction, when all hope seemed lost, what made you decide to help us? Elena thought about that question, remembering the moment when she had first seen the desperation in Velter's eyes. She thought about the Marines who had volunteered for a mission they didn't understand.
The Xenos pleaded for help. Human Marines emerged from the fog. HFY Sci-Fi.